And we're live. Hello, everybody. Today it's my it's my third time, my third pleasure and distinct privilege to welcome David Amerland, the author of the excellent book called The Sniper Mind, which is coming out in the beginning of November of this year. You can pre-order the book right now on Amazon, and you can go to davidamerland.com. You can go to thesnipermind.com as well, which is a site dedicated to this book. The book itself, before we get into the, well, let's say hi to David first. Hi, David.
Oleg, hi. Great to see you.
Always great to see you. So the book is coming out in November, like I said, and you can pre-order it on Amazon right now. They still have it at, I think it's like 46% off, so you can really get a killer deal on it. And being one of the few privileged people who actually read the book in full, I cannot recommend it enough. I mean, it's a killer book. A lot of things in this book are very much common sense, but it gives you a perspective that's different from what normally people think about, because it gives you examples of how these exceptional men and women, in some cases, completely overcome very adverse and very difficult situations and actually excel. So that's the thing that the book, on one hand, it's kind of a historical perspective about some of these amazing feats that the snipers have done in even going back to hundreds of years ago, basically. David, I don't know what the earliest example is, but David, didn't you mention something from Civil War at some point?
That's right, I did.
Yeah, so we're going back way back, and then of course David also brings back some examples of some exceptional snipers from the World War II, which happen to be Russians, of all people. And also he brings back, the new examples from the Gulf War and, modern basically era. And so, but the key thing is that the book really shows historical perspective of what these people have done, and then backs it up with science of the brain and recent discoveries in terms of being able to look at the brains of these exceptional people and see how you can transform your brain to be able, you're not going to become a sniper or anything like that. I mean, that's not going to happen. But at the same time, you can use some of the same techniques and same capabilities that they use to excel, to do the same thing in business. That's basically what this book is about. So with that being the case, if you haven't listened to the first two videos on this, go ahead and check it out, because we're kind of moving through the book as it's written, and so it goes in the order of the book. So the next thing, David, I want to talk about today is mindfulness and its impact on the brain.
That's right, yeah. How would you like to start on this?
Well, in the book, you make a number of basically sentiments in the book about the fact that mindfulness plays a huge role, and ability of the snipers to just basically get into the zone, into the flow, as they call it, where they're able to completely ignore everything around them, all these bullets whizzing by, all these people trying to kill them, all these people running around, things exploding. You got all this incredibly jarring and incredibly, basically, it's a very different scenario when you're sitting at the desk, like I'm sitting right now, and you're doing something, a particular task, and, it's pretty quiet. It's nice, I have nice greenery outside, and everything is kind of calm and collected, and I'm just sitting and doing my work. And that's how most people work, in their business environments. That's how it is. Now we're talking about the sniper situation. You're talking about, unbelievable amount of noise, unbelievable, the earth is practically shaking, every half a second, and you have bullets whizzing by where they literally come within inches, sometimes even closer to your head. And you know that one of these bullets can easily kill you. So you're sitting in a totally different environment. How do you get into this situation, being able to just kind of tune everything out, slow everything up to the point where, or slow everything down, I should say, to the point of being able to just concentrate on what you're doing and excel at what you're doing. So I think that's where mindfulness comes in, be able to help you get into that state.
This is an incredibly dense situation to explain. So let's take it in layers, and I'll try and shed as much light as possible. And I'll preface it that before I even wrote that chapter, I spent probably a good couple hundred hours playing Sniper Elite on, on PlayStation. And anybody who smirks at that, well, I defy you to play it in sniper mode. We basically, everything is in terms of the ballistics of the bullets and the deadliness of the enemy and the sounds you make is simulated almost in sort of real kind of effect. So the AI of the game doesn't give you many breaks. It is incredibly difficult. You don't survive 2 minutes because every mistake you make is basically deadly. And here's what I learned playing that game. Essentially, the moment you focus on what you do as yourself and you're aware of yourself, you're going to fail. There's too many variables to juggle. The moment you start worrying about your score and the time in trying to improve it, you're going to fail. The moment you start consciously trying to do something quickly and really force it, you will fail. So when do you not fail? Now, I've played a lot of this game. Despite the number of hours I've put in, I'm probably less than a mediocre player. But I learned a lot about it through my own failings. When my mind was not on myself, when I was just chilling, that's when I was on my best. And this is what I found out. Basically, when I did that, I was able to calculate almost without thinking about it, where the enemy was coming from, what I should be doing, and what I should do next. And here's the trick. You cannot do something without a plan, what you're going to do next. You should be able to know where you're going to go, how are you going to go, what is the enemy around you doing. And this is just a game, right? I'm sitting in my living room, chilling. I'm not on a battlefield. So the moment I take myself out of the equation, it becomes a lot easier. So the question here is why? Well, how does it happen even? Let's examine how the mind, the brain basically works. The world which we see, the world we look around us, is not really the world that's out there. It is the world we expect to be out there. Now, most of the time, our expectation, which is back from experience and knowledge and prior sort of contact, is 99.9 correct. So, you look out, you glance out the window of your office, you take in what's out there, but you haven't really taken in everything that's out there. Your brain has pre-filled a lot of the information because a lot of it doesn't change. Think of it almost like visiting a website which you visited before on your browser. What does your computer do? It's got a cache, right? So basically it preloads those pages because they haven't changed. You think, whoa, that was a fast website. And it loads in time the page which is different. And that's how you see the information. So basically that's how the brain works. But this is not how it should work, especially when we are in situations which are critical, in situations which are fluid, and in situations, if it's a war room, which is potentially dangerous. But in a business environment, any kind of situation where we don't take reality into account fully is potentially dangerous in terms of lack of success, potential for failure, and so on. So how do we do all this? Well, if we basically allow ourselves to be immersed in a task, if we allow ourselves to be measured in the way that we absorb, and this sounds a little bit mystical, but it isn't really. All it means is that, take your ego out of the game. Forget what it makes you look like. Focus on the task at hand and make that task your sole reason to be for a short time. And then that changes completely everything because you learn to take pride in your work, you engage from a neurobiological point of view, more centers of your brain, you activate more reward circuits. So suddenly you become absorbed in what you're doing. It becomes a reward in its own right, being able to do it well. And if you do something well, then there's no limit. You want to do it to the best of your ability. So if you do all these things, suddenly the way you approach any kind of decision making changes drastically. And in the book, obviously, I give you a lot of practical steps on how to do this. But just that mental flip where you say, okay, it's not what I'm going to get out of it in terms of kudos and accolades and slaps in the back. It's not how I'm going to look to other people. It's not my ego and the stroking which it needs. It is me trying to get a job done to the best of my ability, and then if I can, better, because it's a job and it fulfills me. Well, if we approach things that way, then we are able to essentially look at things in a much clearer perspective. The brain takes a more granular approach. By activating more centers, you begin to see more of the reality and the underlying facts which guide your perception. So your perception changes. So that little mental flip can change everything. And it sounds so easy, It isn't, because we are hardwired to make those assumptions. We're hardwired to glance out our office window and not see anything because we don't expect anything to change. So looking is different to seeing. We need to learn how to see.
Right, and I think doing this mindfulness, doing this exercise in mindfulness, and calming your brain down and letting it rest a little bit and getting away from the norm, I think plays a huge role in allowing it to get into the state of exceptional performance with whatever is done. I think from, like, for example, I go play ping pong with my son, and this is, I think it's a good analogy here, is that when we play ping pong, if you're even a little bit good at ping pong, you know you don't have time to stop and think, okay, I'm now gonna spin it the ball this way, and then I'm gonna turn the racket at this angle, and that will enable. Nobody thinks that way. You don't have any time. And so the
Exactly.
idea is, the thing with your what you said, David, about taking your ego out of the mix, is when you start talking about I'm going to finish the sentence however you want, that's where the ego is in there. Not ego in terms of being egotistical or
Exactly.
anything,
Exactly. Yeah.
just
And let
putting
me.
yourself into the deal, and that screws everything up, like
Yeah.
David said.
And
Like, exactly.
I played tennis to a high level, and at school I was in the school competition team.
Tennis or ping pong?
I have tennis. I
Okay.
haven't played a lot of ping pong, and you think this is going to transfer, right? And it doesn't quite.
It doesn't. No, it doesn't. Because if
The
you can't,
skills are different and the
right.
mental angles are different.
But if
But
you, I'm
it's
not
what you said.
bringing up.
What you said though. If you play ping pong, and you think, how am I going to look making this shot?
Yeah,
I can
you just
guarantee
lost the
you
point
the
before you even
answer
finish the thought.
every
You lost the
time
point.
is
No, but it's not just
bad.
ping pong. It's also skiing. It's also driving. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do. It's also tennis, obviously. That the brain. We don't have time to stop and think and evaluate things on those kind of things. And I think that's a perfect example of how you take you out. And at the same time, everybody knows that repetition makes things perfect. Practice makes perfect. So the brain learns. The brain, that's what, another thing that's important for people to understand. The brain, if you keep doing the same thing over and over and over, you're not going to achieve a different result. I mean, it's the definition of insanity. But if you're doing the same thing over and over and over, you will learn, your brain will learn how to do that particular thing well. Case in point, for example, music. If you do practice piano or drums or whatever you play, it's only the practice that will make you good. Some people are born with talent. Like you take people like Gina Fidel, who's got amazing artistic talent. She can paint. I mean, it doesn't matter how many hours I would spend, I would still not be able to paint. So that's talent. But if you look at things, for example, like when I play drums, people go, "Oh my God, you play so well." I don't play well at all. But compared to them, I play way. Why? Because I spent at one point, a few hours a day for a few months doing nothing but, exercising, playing drums. So I got to do that. David got to play tennis on a, fairly high level. How? Because he was constantly going and playing and practicing serving and rallying and everything else. So practice definitely makes a huge difference. So it's the similar kind of deal here. The brain would learn if you let it, if you practice. And at the same time, you need to do this mindfulness thing to get it to calm down and relax a little bit. And of course, a lot of people say, that's when you need to get sleep because, all of that. It's true. Sleep is important. But at the same time, if you do this mindfulness thing that David describes in the books on these exercises, it's a huge benefit and huge help in getting your brain to function in a better manner, if you will, that way. And so proceeding past mindfulness, we get into concept that are called triggers. In other words, how do you get into that state of flow, or how do you get into the some kind of mode of operation that would enable you to accomplish certain things? And how do you get out of the rut? Let's say you come to work and you start making some comments, and somebody comes in and says, "What? Did you wake up on the left side of the bed or something today?" People see that you're having some kind of a tough time today or some kind of a tough day. How do you deal with that? And the way you deal with it is by using triggers. You can actually trigger your mind to be able to practically instantly change from being in a sour mood to being in a totally positive and proactive mood. And that's what triggers do. I'll let David explain the details of that.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things here which we need to sort of focus on. The first thing is that the mind itself is incredibly complex as a tool. And although we all have a mind, we all have a brain, unless we actually train it, it's not working the way it's supposed to. This is like, we all have legs, we can all walk. potentially we can all run, but we can't all win marathons or win sprint races. For that, we need to basically train specifically and hone what we have. The other thing is that essentially once we train our brains, that changes not just our perceptions, but also the reality which those perceptions reveal. And every time I mention this, and again, it sounds a little bit mystical, everybody says, well, but the reality is the same, right? Well, no, reality is not the same, because the facts underlying reality are the same for everybody. But because they're filtered through our own perception, the reality which we each see is the reality which we expect to see, or the reality which is made customized to our abilities and limitations. And those who manage to break free of that are aware of both, and then aware of techniques they can use to basically broaden the horizon. And the classic example here is about, the glass. Is it half full or half empty? And the person who thinks it's half empty already has activated in their brains a whole series of centers which have dumped down their ability to think further. Because it's half empty, it's a negative thing, you're hunkering down. The brain and the wiring and the neurochemistry around it is beginning to work against you. If you think it's half full, however, your brain works differently. And all we've changed here is that perception. Is it good or bad? That's all we've done. And that is incredibly empowering. When the moment we realize that the way we look at the world affects how we fit in that world, and then it impacts upon our ability to change that world for the better or for the worse, then everything changes around it. And then, of course, the question which arises out of all this is, well, if it's that easy, why don't we all do it all the time? Well, first of all, it's not that easy. And secondly, anything which has to do with a context where our brains work in that fashion is energy intensive. It requires effort. It doesn't happen effortlessly, which is why we need to train their brains. That's why it needs triggers. That's why it needs awareness. Now, if we put those things in place, we become better functioning cognitive machines. And I'm using an analogy here, obviously. If we don't put those things in place, what happens is our own natural hardwired neural instincts kick in, and those responses which would probably have enabled us to survive 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago, in a modern context, work against us. And that's really what we're struggling against. We're struggling against a biology, a neurobiology which helped us survive, but hasn't evolved sufficiently fast to allow us to deal with the modernity and the speed which everything happens around us.
Yeah, and this is the perfect example of this. I was just going to add the fact that it is a fact that we a lot of times wind up self-sabotaging. It's much easier for us. Like if you look, for example, at people who lie or people who tell the truth, it's far, far easier for somebody to lie. I mean, it's almost a no-brainer how easy it is to lie. But to constantly tell the truth, that's a different story. And so this is where it's a simple example, but it shows the point that we tend to be much easier at doing the negative things than positive things. And so it's the same thing with any of our addictions to food or to drugs or to anything else. All of these things we know they're harmful. I mean, food, obviously, we don't have a choice. But what kind of food? We certainly have a choice. And the bottom line is we choose to make these negative decisions, if you will, and making the positive decisions are a lot tougher. As the joke goes, negative person looks at the glass half empty, positive looks at half full, and realist actually drinks the water. So, there's different ways to look at it. And like David said, it's the perception is what makes a difference. For example, somebody is getting a new job and they think, oh my God, this is such a wonderful thing. I'm going to be able to blah, blah, blah. All these different things. So the other person is kind of like in the corner, oh my God, I'm going to have to drive over there. And I don't know if they're going to have enough parking. And so you basically self-sabotage way ahead of time by having, what is the reality here? Reality is the person got a job. And the reality is that it's the same no matter how you look at it. Well, I should say that. It's how you look at it that makes a difference why it's different. The concept of finding or getting a job is the same. But one person looks at it in one way and the other person looks at it another way. Somebody may look at something as a horrible situation in their life. Other people look at it as a teaching moment. So there's always different ways to look at the same thing. And I think the triggers is what makes a huge difference in terms of being able to get yourself out of the negative and snap yourself into the positive mode, because that's where you want to be. And that's what David's talking about, a bunch of different examples in the book. If you want examples of triggers that are automatic, we didn't even learn. But the idea is you want to learn to do some of these triggers so you can better yourself. Perfect example of a positive trigger would be a song from your past. You're driving in the car, you've had a bad day, you're tired, everything else. All of a sudden, Hey Bulldog comes out from the Beatles, and you're a big Beatles fan like I am. Totally changes your mood, totally, for a short amount of time, but it does. And that's an example of a positive trigger, because it's some kind of song that brought some positive memories for you or put you in kind of a certain moment, boom, you're there. Negative trigger would be, negative trigger would be a police car turning on the siren and the lights behind you. So you were in an awesome mood, you had a race today, everything is peachy. You're driving home, all of a sudden you hear the siren, and yes, they're stopping you, and you have no idea why, but you already feel somewhat negative because you know it's not going to be anything positive.
We all feel guilty.
And you immediately feel guilty, exactly. So this is an example where, the example of your body basically going through a trigger and changing its state based on that trigger. And the idea is to try to learn how to force your mind to use certain triggers to automatically get you back into the positive if you happen to be in the negative. Obviously, you don't need to learn to be negative. You were born with it. But in terms of getting into the positive, that takes some time. Okay, moving on here. The next thing I want to talk about is, speaking of employment, there is a story that David is going to describe to us about this Scott Green gentleman. But the outcome basically here that David's trying to indicate for business use is that to be successful at your job, you need to do three things. Number one is pay attention. Number two is look at the details, or look at details. And number three is show initiative. So those are the three kind of points that David writes in the book that indicate that this is one simple way for you to be successful at your employment, is by paying attention, looking at details, and showing initiative. But this Scott Green story, I don't remember exactly what it is. David, do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is a British person, and I can't really name the company because it was a little bit creepy what he did in certain perspective. But essentially, what happened was, he came out of the army. He's a trained sniper. He needed a job, and he just joined the system like everybody else. And if you're joining a system in Britain, at least this is what happens. There are job centers. Those job centers collect in your area within a certain radius jobs from employers, and then there is staff in those job centers who help you to put together an application. They help you to make sure your CV is all right, and they're just trying to get you back into employment. That's their task. So he went to all the job centers in the area, and there was a recession at the time when he came out of the army. He applied, he sent his CV, and nothing, like crickets. So things were getting a little bit desperate. And he had some money when he came out of the army because you come out with a lump sum, but that clearly was not going to last forever. So what he did essentially is he put his military training to effect. He looked at a particular company which he was hoping to work for, and he basically stalked it. He looked at how they were operating. He looked at times the trucks were coming in, times the trucks were coming out, pretty much like a military operation. And based on his knowledge and awareness of how these things connected, then he went into, he obviously he did his homework in the company. He found out, what their income is, their outcome, etc., and what their areas of expertise. And they weren't looking to hire him or anything, but he said, look, I'm gonna, if you give me a few minutes of your time, I can show you how to save X amount of money. I think it was about £50,000 at the time, which is a lot of money. So the manager, they thought, okay, this is a bit, out of left field in terms of an interview, but they gave him a few minutes to see how, whether he was genuine, and that turned into, I think, an hour-long interview where they asked him all these questions, and he explained his method and everything, and they were sort of like stunned because he was telling them things which are obvious in retrospect, but they hadn't really thought about them. And they said, okay, sure. Now, leave it with us. Let us see, and we'll call you back. And I think a few weeks passed, and he was getting a little bit desperate, thinking, okay, he gave them away basically everything. He told them, what to do in terms of optimizing their operation and saving some money. and they're going to take it and run with it without offering him a job. But they rang back, and they had basically created a very specific post for him in the company because they didn't have a job to offer him, but they wanted to take advantage of his knowledge and skills. So they gave him a job, and he's still with them. He's doing great. But this is a classic case of initiative first, creative thinking second, but it's also the transfer of skills from one area, excuse me, from one area of your life to another. And if you can do that, if you can achieve that kind of thing, and we all can, we just need to have the awareness of how we click in. We tend to compartmentalize things. And I'll give you, we say, for instance, the things you learn in the army haven't got any application in the real world because you don't go around killing people. But this is not what you do in the army. I mean, they train you to do that because that's the end result, because it's war at the end of the day. But in order to achieve that, I mean, basically what the army tries to help you do is remain alive, not die. And you learn an entirety of skills which go around that supporting task. And they are very transferable into real life. There are other arenas we can use. If you look at baseball, if you look at elite sports, if you look at martial arts, if you look at boxing, any of those things, they look like recreation or violent sports or contact sports or whatever you may want to call them. But at the end of the day, when you actually look at the discipline and the layering and the structure that goes around them, you learn lessons which, if you leave behind, they stay behind and never follow you through. But if you choose to apply them in your everyday life, you will hugely benefit from. And the commonalities here, the common sort of threads amongst pretty much any kind of field operating at peak level, is a kind of awareness, mindfulness, attention to detail, and willingness, basically, to not take things for granted. Constantly assess and improve, adapt, overcome, always. It's a kind of approach. And that's the same. If you talk to an elite basketball player, and if you talk to an elite baseball player, and if you talk to an elite boxer, and if you talk to a Navy SEAL, if for a minute you shut your eyes and you listen and talk not about what they do, but about how they do things, you can't tell them apart. There's such an overlap in their approach, and their fields are so different. Take an elite business person who actually has performed successfully for a number of years and has a demonstrable track record, and he's entirely in the same group. So that shows that essentially what makes us good at anything is the mental state which we're able to apply. And obviously it's backed by specific knowledge, intent, awareness, and so on, inclination. But the underlying structure, the underlying mental game is the same.
Okay, so those are the three things. If you want to excel at your job, this is what you need to do. And if you're a sniper, it's even better. Now, let's move on to the next part here.
I can tell you're enamored with snipers now.
Exactly. No, it's awesome. So that's this kind of green story, which is pretty amazing. It's kind of like a little bit of the story of the what was that movie that Will Smith made about this gentleman that was really poor, and he learned all stock symbols, and then he was able to then get a job at the stock market and
oh yes, I remember the one. I can't remember the title. It's so long ago. Yes,
the Silicon Valley, where people really apply themselves, do something, and then they get rewarded for it in the end. So it definitely pays to do this. So that takes us to adapt and overcome, which is basically shutting everything down in the face of extreme stress to be calm and concentrate better on the task at hand. And that's the main motto of the snipers, which is adapt and overcome. So maybe, David, you can go a little bit more into detail about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is an easy thing, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing that people say, oh, you'll adapt and overcome, right? It's like saying, well, you don't get fit, right? All you got to do is exercise more, eat less. I mean, these are meaningless words, because if something is difficult, if we cannot do it, whether it's fitness or it's success in business, it means there's a complexity there which we haven't understood. And what we need to understand is that complexity and begin to tackle it. So basically, in any kind of situation when we feel overwhelmed, we need to learn how to deal with it. Obviously, the first thing is keep calm, and this is really difficult. You focus on your breathing. Take a few 2-3 deep breaths. breathe in through your nose, go out through the mouth. And you say, why? Why can't I just breathe quickly through my mouth? Well, because now we have neuroscientific studies which show that if you breathe in through the nose and exhale through the mouth, you activate parts of your brain which engage in strategic thinking. And those parts of your brain are not activated if you just breathe in quickly in and out through your mouth. So essentially, by doing that, you activate parts of your brain which allow you to look at things a little bit more dispassionately and a little bit more analytically, which means instantly that the moment you begin to analyze things and you begin to quieten down your emotions, then you begin to get a grip on the situation. So your panic levels begin to drop because you feel you have more control. Because you have more control, you become more detail orientated, which means you actually see more of the underpinning reality, excuse me. So once you see the underpinning reality, then your perception begins to change, which suddenly means that your decision-making process is entirely different now because you see things differently. And all we've done here is breathe differently.
Okay,
Now,
just for the record here, before we get sued, I want to make a disclaimer so everything's peachy with everybody. That does not mean you stop breathing completely. David means don't breathe fast. Doesn't mean you slow it down to the point where you quit breathing. So I just want to make sure it's clear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thank you for that. So essentially, I mean, these are the things which allow us to dump down on our emotions. And this is not the same as stopping your emotions from happening. It's acknowledgement. You know, if something scares you and you don't know what it is, right? Your heart rate goes up, your palms go clammy, you begin to feel sweat on your brow, and you begin to panic. And if you say, okay, what is it that's scaring me? Break it down. Look at the scene around you. Is it the lights? Is it the shadows? Is it the people? If it's the people, why? The moment you begin to analyze this, what happens? You begin to suddenly control the situation because you can see all the elements coming together. Your panic levels drop. Your sense of calm is restored. Your sense of control is restored. Your sense of capability in yourself is restored. What happens to your decision making just then? Changes. So again, you know, these are things which seem obvious in retrospect. They are not, because our initial knee-jerk reaction is the one that basically kicks in unless we're aware of the fact that it's happening, and then we know what to do in order to stop it.
And I think it's important to, to remember at this point, I think it's an important thing to make a point about that, is that we're one of the few species out there that are able to talk that, Oleg would say this and Oleg would say that. In other words, you're able to talk to yourself from a third person perspective. So it means, like, my son asked me, how do I such and such? Because, we talk a lot about the sniper mind, and I'm trying to feed him with his brain with anything I can possibly feed at this point while he's still listening to me at this age. But the bottom line being is that you can't, he asked, how do you do that? Well, you have to tell yourself this. You have to teach yourself that. And so this is an example where you're using the third person as if it was there, that person was there, to teach yourself something else, even though that third person is you. So that's one way to think about it, is you put yourself in a third person perspective, but that third person is you teaching you how to do something better, how to become something better.
Yeah.
And I think that's right here what David is talking about, is that, when you say, well, I can't, well, as the famous statement goes, whether you can't or you can, it's totally true. So you're the one who makes the final call, whether you can or whether you can't. And so you're the one, and going back to what David said earlier about when he was doing tennis, but he was trying to compete, you compete with yourself. I mean, that's another important thing to remember. If you try to compete with somebody else, you're always going to lose. There's always going to be somebody who's better than you, maybe not this year, but next year. With all of us aging in the wrong direction, it's just the way it works. You're not going to be best at whatever you're doing forever. It's just nature of the universe we live in. But at the same time, if you simply compete with yourself, then it becomes a totally doable game. And even small incremental games, little baby steps type deal. If you don't know what that is, watch the movie What About Bob? If you do the baby steps, then you'll see how things are improving for yourself, and you and the third person, which is also you, which means nobody's working against you. Both of these people are working for you. You will see tangible results if you do that. So all of this kind of comes together. And one of the things
I was going to say, I'm very glad you mentioned the thing about ping pong and tennis, but essentially, in martial arts, the dictum is that the only opponent you ever face is you. And if you think about martial arts, if you're competing, it's an incredibly stressful situation. And the potential for harm is very small. You're padded up, you're controlled, there are umpires everywhere, and you're doing it for points. It's not cage fighting. So if you're doing a competitive martial arts, it's a point system. So the potential for you to seriously get hurt, it's absolutely minuscule. It's a pretty safe sport. So what are you afraid of? You're afraid of losing. Why? Because you're being observed. People are going to say, you lost, which means you invest a lot of your ego into the game, and that needs to go. Because if you're investing your ego into the game, you're so afraid of losing, you can't analyze what's happening. You can't think what's happening. And everything happens too fast because you're trying to work it out. And your martial arts usually have either 1 3-minute round or 2 3-minute rounds or 2 2-minute rounds, depending on the system. So it's not a lot of time. Everything happens really, really quickly in a very compressed environment. So you need to basically defeat yourself. You need to say all that fear, whether, if I do my best, win or lose, I still win, right? So it goes away. And I'm here to enjoy myself.
And also, I think it's important to know the fact that when you're practicing, most of the time what you're doing in martial arts, you're practicing. You're not competing with anybody. You're basically doing exercise. You're practicing by yourself, usually in a room with potentially additional accessories and everything. I don't know what they're officially called because they do martial arts, but
yes, but well, when you're competing though, you're actually fighting against somebody, and you
right.
do want
But
to
I'm
win.
saying most of the time you spend is at home practicing it. You're not really competing with anybody. You're just practicing, trying to get better at doing it. If you look at music, music is a perfect example too.
Yes.
You're not competing with anybody in music. Unless it's you're going to some kind of piano competition at some point. Initial practice and study for getting to that competition is you playing yourself. You're not competing against anybody at that point. So, but you're trying to get better. So this is, I think, it's an excellent example, even though I said it, of competing basically with yourself, but you're not really competing. You're just trying to improve yourself. And so if you want to look at it as competition with yourself, if it makes you feel better, you can do it, but you're basically doing it to yourself, and you're trying to better yourself. And that's a better way to look at it than in terms of doing everything else, basically, than trying to compete with somebody like for whatever the situation may be. If you compete with yourself, you have a chance of winning. If you compete with somebody, let's say, to give you an extreme example, let's say I decide I want to start doing some swimming, for example, competitively, right? And I go to every day swim and everything else. And in my brain, my goal is to beat Michael Phelps. It's not happening. I don't have the length of his hands. I don't have his years and years of practice. I don't have anything. So the chances of me being
massive.
And this is a perfect example where people sometimes set goals for themselves which are completely unachievable. There's nothing wrong with setting up goals, but you have to have some sense of reality about how achievable is this goal. And if the goal is not achievable, you're basically beating your head against cement wall. You may bruise your head many times, but you're not breaking through that wall. And so that's where a lot of people have a problem, I think, in trying to understand that number one, you're competing with yourself. Number two, the goals need to be achievable. They may be high, but they need to be achievable. And so this is an example here. So in terms of dealing with all this, in terms of being able to, pull off all-nighters, as David does a lot of times, he talks in the book about, some of these people, including himself, obviously, spending long nights with short naps and coffee. So David, in terms of that, do you want to kind of elaborate a little bit about more? Because I think a lot of people in business do find very little amount of time that they have, and they still need, they have these monumental set of tasks that they need to get done. And so let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Basically, in everything which challenges us, we have two choices. The obvious choice is not to be challenged by it. Remove yourself from the situation, which means that you have to readjust your goals. The other choice is find ways to cope with it. Now, when it comes to, and we all face this, we never have enough time to do what actually needs to be done. And the only thing which we encroach upon is sleep, because essentially that's one large chunk of time which we feel we can shorten sometimes, perhaps catch up on later on, etc. But sleep is actually really necessary. It's necessary in terms of resetting the brain and helping with memory and helping with learning patterns. It is absolutely critical for resetting the body, helping it heal and so on. So you can't really do that forever. So really, it comes down to what you said a bit earlier, it's in terms of setting realistic goals, realizing where your limitations are, and playing to your strengths. So really what you need to do is have a kind of coping strategy which allows you to deal with large tracts of time where you can go sleepless and perform without your performance dropping. And the classic thing here is understanding how the brain works. Now, the brain basically will work to a high level for a long period of time. It will be able to you can intake a bit of stimulants in terms of coffee perhaps, and that keeps you awake, keeps you alert. But at the same time, if you engage in routine tasks which slow the brain down, because it's tired, it's going to fall asleep and your concentration will go, and that's it. You defeat yourself. So you need to be strategic in how you do it. Classic example, and this is how people in the military do it. Essentially, they take naps whenever they can. So if you've got downtime, you're not doing anything else, great way to take a nap. And if you are having problems unplugging because your brain is racing and you think, oh, I can't fall asleep, then you got problems because you're not controlling your brain and you need to control it. So here's the first lesson in discipline. The second thing is that when you're working, you need to focus for as long as you can. The moment you can't, tank up with a little bit of coffee and get a 20-30 minute nap. Now, what happens in that period? This is what happens. Your brain is tired, you go into REM sleep, so you go into a deep sleep. At the same time, however, because your brain is alert and coffee kicks in, you don't go into such a deep sleep that when you wake up from it, you feel completely broken and focused and not connected to anything. It just feels refreshing. So you come up again, okay, is it like a full night's sleep? No, it isn't. But it allows you to function, and that's what it is. So if you're doing this on a whim, well, there's no point to it because you're only getting yourself tired on a whim and there's no focus or anything. But if you're doing it for something very specific, and in my case, I was finishing a book at an extremely tight deadline, and the writing task was massive. It felt like I was actually achieving something every time I did it, and that also activates the reward centers in your brain, and that keeps you going, gives you a sense of elation. So although you're feeling tired, you feel you're winning, you feel you're moving forward, and you're achieving things. And the other thing is, you can do this for a number of times, and I did it for almost on and off for about 3 months solid, where I was getting about between 3 and 4 hours sleep a day. But there were days in those 3-4 months when I would get like 10 hours because you need to tank up a little bit. So basically, you can tank up on sleep, and if you sleep for 2-3 days normally and you have a lot of sort of rest, then you'll find that it is easier for you to pull out an all-nighter without feeling extremely tired. Is all this difficult? It is. Do it for specific purposes. Do it to enhance what you're doing, to help you achieve it. Don't do it so you can say, oh, I pulled out an all-nighter. It was great. I watched Netflix. That's the wrong thing to do.
Sorry, I just want to try a little microphone.
I'm not going to kill you.
And I'm totally alert now. I'm totally focused. Yeah,
Obviously,
I just had this terrifying thought. Because you're doing this to yourself, all of a sudden in the middle of a conversation, you're just going to zone out and fall asleep. No, we're not doing that. We're doing
You're just catching a mini nap, weren't you?
exactly, yeah, because it was time. You were talking, so I thought I'd get.
I appreciate that.
I appreciate it. But anyway, seriously though, certainly, the deal with short naps and coffee, it's like David said, it definitely is a situation with discipline. And a lot of things having to do with discipline, basically in the book, David says that attitude is everything. And that's exactly the situation with just about anything you do in life, that the attitude that you take, whether you use triggers to get you into a better mood and be able to do more, or whether you do some exercising to help you fall asleep easier, or just to feel more refreshed, to get going, or whatever different things you do, the attitude makes a huge difference. And as we mentioned earlier, the deal with, that's what SEALs do, is this ability, not ability, but all of us can do it, of talking yourself as a third person from that perspective and being your own coach, if you will. In other words, you have this third person that knows what's right, what should be done, and you have you who potentially is not doing what should be done. So you have this, personal coach, whatever you want to call this third person, which is still you. It's still you. There's nothing to be afraid of because it's still you. Telling yourself that you need to do this. And the attitude is a huge part of this. And one of the things that also David talks about in the book is goals, that we just touched on, and the importance of doing goals in what in the book David calls micro goals. That's what basically SEALs do. Is micro goals are essentially taking a big goal and breaking it down to small, manageable tasks. And that's something that's very familiar to people who do programming of computers, because it's almost impossible to sit down and just write a huge program that does a lot of different things that would work very well. I mean, it's you know, everybody knows about computer bugs and programs and things not working exactly right on any kind of level. So it's something that's almost impossible to eliminate. But at the same time, the only way you can assure that you get things done reasonably well is by breaking things down into absolute minute tasks, because computers are stupid. They don't know anything. They can't do anything on their own. You know, it's basically, as I always refer to them, you know, nowadays, cheap piece of plastic and metal. But at the same time, they can do tremendous things if they're taught. And to be able to teach them, you need to do it, you know, little steps at a time, teaching them exactly precisely what to do. And it's the same thing with practically everything else you do, that you take a big task or a big goal that you have, and then you try to think about it and shrink it down to multiple steps. And then you want to take those multiple steps and shrink them down into even smaller steps to be as small as you can possibly make it, because two things happen. That tiniest step, the tiniest goal that you have, this micro goal, is fairly easy to achieve because it's very small. It doesn't take a lot of time, and also it's very achievable in terms of what it's supposed to do. So you can get that done, and now you all of a sudden feel good about yourself because you got something accomplished. And the more things you get accomplished, the better it makes you feel, the more energized you feel about the success of overall goal, and you just keep moving down, basically almost like stepping through steps to get from point A to point B. I mean, same kind of example. So that's one of the things that SEALs do in terms of coming up with, you know, breaking things down to smaller parts, and then doing the third person talk to yourself, and they achieve the results they achieve, which anybody can do the same. David, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm thinking, you know, we think of that moment in the Matrix early on when Trinity goes flying across the rooftops and goes through glass opening, tumbles down some stairs and is waiting for the agent. And now think about it, right? She knows that she cannot beat an agent. She cannot defeat it. So she's waiting for it to come through, and if it does, she's going to die. She's paralyzed with fear. She's hurt a little bit. She's there waiting with the guns. And what does she say? She says to herself, "Get up, Trinity." And she repeats it a couple of times, really forcefully. And what does she do? She gets up and runs away. And that's a classic example. It's that ability to be your own cheerleader. And from a cognitive perspective, we are unique in this. We're able to dissociate ourselves and look at us dispassionately from a third person point of view. And the moment we do that, we basically create an extra layer of filtering in terms of the affective element which we feel. There are fears and emotions and passions and weaknesses. And then we can see things a little bit more dispassionately. We can say, do this because you can do it. Do that because you can do it. You can say to yourself, that's what you need to do, and go ahead and do it. And basically that allows the brain again itself to rise to the occasion, to click in and actually say it. And that's how you, again, you take your own ego, your own, whatever you're feeling, your weakness, your fear, your fatigue, your uncertainty, and we all have those emotions. They're common to everybody. You take them out of the picture, and you know, you have that voice there telling you what to do. And I think that's a skill which again needs to be developed.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're coming up here. I looked at my list, and there's no way we're getting done today. So I think what we'll do is
we may have another one. Yes.
Well, we're gonna have part 4. Absolutely, I was thinking it was gonna happen too. So the good news about part 4 is that's gonna be the last one. So if you guys are kind of waiting to see the end of the line, this will be the end of the line on part 4, because there's just too many steps to cover still. The book is called The Sniper Mind, written by David Amerland. And it's coming out on November 7th, and it's going to be everywhere. You know, like right now, everybody's driving to Oregon to look at the eclipse, and you know, people are looking at this eclipse like it's some kind of godsend. In November, it's going to be the same thing with David's book. It's going to be everywhere. Everybody's going to be running out to try to get this book, and I certainly suggest you avoid the lines and do the same thing I will do, which is watch the eclipse without buying any glasses or anything right there on TV. Or you can go and, you know, sit in traffic for hours, do it that way. In terms of David Amerland's book here, avoid the lines. Don't go to any Barnes & Noble or anything. Simply order online from Amazon, save 46%. I mean, it's a win-win situation using this kind of approach. David, any last words before we wrap it up, this third part?
Well, I was going to say, we have only, in terms of how we operate from a neuroscientific point of view, we're only beginning to scratch the surface. Neuroscience has given us tools which allow us now to look deep into the thinking mind. And what we are seeing is essentially a mind or an organism or a network, if you like, that can reroute itself, reprogram itself on the fly, and allows us to change its performance levels as long as we know how the whole thing falls together. If we don't, we can't. And basically, a lot of the things that you learn in the book is about that. It's how you can affect your own performance. So it starts with that kind of awareness.
Yeah. And, I was just thinking a little bit of philosophy on the third person. Nobody's advocating running around and yelling at yourself in the street somewhere or anything like that. But seriously, though, there's nothing, if you think about examples of some people who kind of talk to themselves out loud, it's a coping mechanism for a lot of people who do actually, unfortunately, have some mental issues. But it is a coping, no, but seriously, I've been told.
I agree totally, yes.
I've been
Yeah, no,
told
you're
that
right.
it's a coping mechanism for some of these folks. And the bottom line is it does somehow calm them down and makes them feel better by talking to themselves. And so
Yes.
we're advocating, from since we were children, we were told, don't talk to yourself, don't talk to yourself. People will think you're nuts, things like that. And so we were kind of pushed to a degree not to move into that mode of thinking of talking to ourselves. But at the same time, if you think about all the problems in the world and everything that's going on, and all the people, people have all kinds of agendas all the time, and people do things, people are selfish. I mean, all kinds of different things. We kind of are adjusted since we were children to the mode where most of the people out there, I shouldn't say most, some people out there, that's probably a better definition, are doing things based on whatever they need or they want done based on their own agendas, and their own agendas always precede ours. So we always need to be careful about people talking to us or suggesting things to us because they're selling to us. If they're talking to us, they're selling something. They always have some sort of agenda. And so because our minds have been conditioned, I think, to be in that kind of mode, that kind of state, I think it's that much more important to remember that we ourselves, when we talk in the third person to ourselves, quietly in our mind, not out in the open,
Yes.
we do that knowing that there is no agenda of any kind behind there. In other words, it's not like somebody's trying to tell us to do something to benefit them. I mean, it's kind of a convoluted way of looking at it, but it's also a realistic way of looking at it. You look at it from this perspective, like right now, for example, we're doing this hangout, right? There's a tremendous amount of information in this book that could be very helpful to you. But at the same time, I'm sure plenty of people watching and saying, well, the guy is just trying to sell his book. And you're right, he is trying to sell his book. And I hope he sells a ton of these books because he's a friend, and I think it's a phenomenal book. But yes, one of the reasons we're doing this is so people go buy the book and benefit from this book. So it's not just selling the book, it's also getting the benefit from the book. But at the same time, people start thinking in the wrong direction. Why is this being done? Why is that being said? Things like that. When you're talking to yourself, there is none of these things come into play. None of them. Because it's you. And obviously, you're not going to be trying to sell yourself on something that's going to be damaging to yourself. Unless, you're on Breaking Bad trying to, sell drugs or something to yourself.
Yes.
No, don't want to be doing that. But I'm just saying, again, going back to serious for a moment, if you think about it, you would not be doing something harmful to yourself. That's the normal mode of operation for a vast majority of normal, mentally normal people, let's say. And so with that being the case, 100% that you're just trying to improve yourself or do better for yourself. And that's why it makes that much sense to have this other persona of yourself tell your other self, if you will, that something should be done, and encourage and make sure that happens, because then you actually achieve the results that you want to achieve. And everybody's happy. Right, David?
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself.
I couldn't say it better myself either, but I already said it. So anyway, go to Amazon, get the book. It's an awesome book. And if you have any questions, you can find David Amerland on his website, on davidamerland.com. You can go to the snipermind.com to get all kinds of articles, information about the book. There's also some really interesting historical photos that David has in the book, and he's got on the side. He constantly publishes tons of posts, which are always kind of, you can almost look at it like a tree. You have the Sniper Mind tree, and you have all these waves, all these branches going off, that you read something and you don't even realize it has to do with something being said in the book. The book is, I mean, I can't say how great this book is in many ways, and of course it's different for different people, but I can't recommend it high enough. With that said, thank you very much for listening, and we'll make sure to get you up the first two parts of this, and also the upcoming last part will be the finale sometime before the book comes out. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.